Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished checking the last soil sample of the day. The research station on Kepler 442b hummed quietly. Around him, with the sounds of alien voices and strange equipment, he had been working on this planet for 6 months now, and still felt amazed every morning when he looked out at the purple sky and orange grass that covered the landscape. The station was home to scientists from 4 different species all working together to study this strange new world. The building itself was a marvel of engineering, built by the Vorthak, who were tall beings made of living crystal. Their bodies looked like walking diamonds that caught and reflected light in beautiful patterns. Jixt was their leader and commander of the station. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, and his crystal body made soft chiming sounds when he moved. The Vorthak had designed the station to be comfortable for all species, with perfect temperature control and air systems that could handle different breathing needs. Working alongside Jake were the Skarn researchers, who looked like large lizards that walked on 2 legs. Dr. Kess was the head Skarn scientist, and she spent most of her time studying the local plant life. Her scales were dark green with silver patterns, and she had large yellow eyes that could see things humans could not. The Skarn came from hot desert worlds and loved the warm climate that Kepler 442b usually provided. The strangest members of the team were the Nebulites, who were beings made of gas that floated in special containment suits. They looked like colorful clouds trapped in glass containers with mechanical arms and legs attached. The Nebulites could change their density and color based on their emotions, and they communicated through patterns of light that flashed across their gaseous bodies. They were excellent at studying the atmosphere and weather patterns of new worlds. Jake was one of only 2 humans on the station. Lisa Chun worked in the communications department and helped coordinate between all the different species. She had been Jake's friend since they arrived together from Earth, and they often ate meals together while talking about home. The other species found human behavior interesting, especially their ability to adapt to new situations quickly. The planet had been perfect for research, with its stable weather and comfortable temperatures that stayed around 72 degrees during the day and dropped to about 60 at night. The local star provided steady warmth, and the planet's orbit was so regular that the alien scientists had built their research schedule around the predictable seasons. Everything had been going smoothly until the morning when Jake noticed something strange happening in the sky. He was outside collecting samples when he saw unusual flashes of light coming from the direction of the star. The flashes were bright and came in quick bursts that made the purple sky flicker like a broken light bulb. Jake had studied astronomy in college, and he knew these were solar flares, but they seemed much stronger than anything he had seen before. He quickly gathered his equipment and headed back to the station to report what he had observed. Inside the station, Jixt was already receiving reports from the Nebulites, who had detected strange energy readings in the upper atmosphere. The gaseous beings were flashing urgent red patterns in their containment suits as they tried to explain what their instruments were showing. Dr. Kess was also concerned because her weather monitoring equipment was giving readings that made no sense. The temperature sensors were showing impossible drops in air temperature that should not happen on a stable planet like this one. Jake found Lisa in the communications room, where she was trying to contact the main research headquarters on a distant space station. The radio signals were being disrupted by the solar activity, and she could only get through for a few seconds at a time. She looked worried as she explained that the flares were much stronger than anyone had predicted, and they were already affecting the planet's magnetic field. Within an hour, the effects became clear and frightening. The temperature began dropping fast as the solar flares disrupted the planet's normal weather patterns. The comfortable 72 degrees fell to 60, then 50, then 40 as the alien scientists watched their instruments with growing alarm. The station's heating system had been designed for minor temperature adjustments, not for a major climate emergency like this. Jake felt the cold air flowing through the station's air vents, but he was not too concerned yet. He had grown up in Minnesota, where winter temperatures often dropped below 0, and he knew how to handle cold weather. But as he looked around at his alien colleagues, he realized they were in serious trouble. The Vorthak were designed for stable temperatures, and Jixt's crystal body was already showing small stress fractures as the cold affected his molecular structure. The Skarn came from hot desert worlds, and Dr. Kess was moving slower as her reptilian body tried to conserve heat by entering a hibernation state. The Nebulites were having the worst problems as their gaseous bodies began to condense in the cold air. Their bright colors were fading, and they were struggling to maintain their normal density inside their containment suits. The mechanical systems that kept them stable were working harder, but they were not designed for such extreme temperature changes. By evening, the temperature had dropped to 15 degrees and the station's heating system was completely overwhelmed. Emergency alarms were sounding, and Jixt was trying to coordinate an evacuation request, but the solar flares were still blocking most communications. The few messages that got through indicated that rescue ships would not be able to reach them for at least 3 days. Because of the dangerous space weather, Jake stood at one of the station's windows, looking out at the orange grass that was now covered with frost. His breath made small clouds in the cold air inside the station as the heating system struggled to keep up. He could see ice forming on the purple plants outside, and he knew the situation was only going to get worse. While his alien friends huddled around the few working heaters and talked about emergency procedures, Jake began thinking about the local environment and what resources might be available to help them survive until rescue arrived. The next morning brought even worse news, as the temperature had dropped to -5 degrees overnight. Jake woke up to the sound of emergency alarms and the worried voices of alien scientists, who were struggling to cope with the deadly cold. The station's main heating unit had failed during the night, and backup systems were running at maximum capacity, just to keep the temperature inside from dropping below freezing. Jixt's crystal body now had visible cracks running through it, and he moved very carefully to avoid further damage. The stress fractures would become permanent if the cold continued and could eventually cause his body to shatter completely. Dr. Kess had entered a partial hibernation state and was barely responsive as her Skarn physiology shut down non-essential functions to conserve energy. The Nebulites were in critical condition as their gaseous forms continued to condense, and several of them had already begun turning into liquid puddles inside their containment suits. Jake found Lisa in the supply room where she was taking inventory of emergency equipment and blankets. Her hands were shaking from the cold, but she was still trying to help coordinate the crisis response. The other species were gathering around the few working heaters and discussing evacuation procedures, but Jake could see they were running out of options quickly. The backup power would not last more than another day or two, and rescue ships was still blocked by the ongoing solar storm activity. While the aliens debated emergency protocols and tried to contact headquarters, Jake made a decision that surprised everyone. He announced that he was going outside to study the local plant life and see if there were any natural materials that could help with their situation. Jixt immediately protested, saying that no species could survive in such extreme temperatures without proper protective equipment. The crystal being's voice had a worried, chiming quality as he tried to convince Jake that leaving the station would be suicide. Dr. Kess managed to lift her head from her hibernation state long enough to express concern about Jake's plan. She explained that her instruments showed the outside temperature was now -15 degrees with strong winds that would make it feel even colder. The Skarn scientist's scales had turned a darker color, and her movements were slow and clumsy as the cold affected her nervous system. She warned that even brief exposure to such temperatures could cause permanent damage or death. Jake appreciated their concern, but he explained that humans were remarkably good at adapting to cold environments. He told them about his childhood in Minnesota, where he had learned survival skills in the Boy Scouts and had often camped outside in winter weather that was much colder than what they were experiencing now. The alien scientists listened with amazement as Jake described how humans could survive in temperatures that would kill most other species through proper preparation and understanding of cold weather survival techniques. Lisa helped Jake gather what little cold weather gear the station had available, including an emergency thermal suit and portable heaters. She was worried about letting him go outside alone, but she understood that someone needed to try something different before they all died from the cold. The thermal suit was designed for brief emergency use and would not provide protection for extended periods, but it would give Jake enough time to study the local environment and gather materials. Before leaving the station, Jake spent time studying the research data about local plant and animal life. Dr. Kess had collected extensive information about the indigenous vegetation, and Jake was particularly interested in a type of fibrous plant that grew in thick patches across the landscape. The plants had evolved to survive the planet's occasional cold snaps, and they had several interesting characteristics that caught Jake's attention. The fibrous plants had thick outer layers that seemed to trap air in small pockets, which could provide natural insulation. The native animals on the planet were known to burrow into these plant masses during cold weather, and Jake wondered if the same principle could be applied to help the alien scientists. He studied images of the plant's cellular structure and noticed that it was remarkably similar to materials that humans had used for insulation throughout history. When Jake finally suited up and prepared to leave the station, his alien colleagues gathered to watch with a mixture of admiration and terror. They could not understand how any being could voluntarily expose themselves to such deadly conditions, but they were beginning to realize that humans had capabilities that other species lacked. Jix wished Jake good luck in his musical crystal voice while Dr. Kess managed to raise one clawed hand in a gesture of farewell. The moment Jake stepped outside the station, he felt the brutal bite of the cold air even through his thermal suit. His breath immediately formed thick clouds, and he could feel the moisture in his nose beginning to freeze. But instead of the panic or immediate physical shutdown that would affect other species, Jake felt his body respond in ways that millions of years of human evolution had programmed into his genes. His metabolism increased to generate more heat, and his blood flow adjusted to protect his vital organs while maintaining function in his extremities. Jake moved carefully across the frozen landscape toward the nearest patch of fibrous plants. The orange grass crunched under his boots, and the purple sky looked darker and more threatening than usual. Strong winds whipped across the plain, carrying ice crystals that stung his exposed face, but he pressed forward with determination. He knew that his alien friends were depending on him to find a solution, and he was not going to let them down. When he reached the plant patch, Jake was amazed by what he found. The fibrous vegetation had naturally arranged itself into dense clusters that created warm microclimates protected from the wind. Small native creatures had burrowed deep into the plant masses and seemed to be surviving the cold weather by taking advantage of the natural insulation. Jake used his portable tools to take samples of the plant material and study its structure more closely. The plants were even better than he had hoped, with hollow fibers that trapped air and created excellent insulation properties. The material was also surprisingly strong and flexible, which meant it could potentially be woven or shaped into useful forms. Jake carefully collected several large bundles of the fibrous material while his alien colleagues watched from the station windows, with growing amazement at his ability to work in conditions that would have killed them within minutes. Jake returned to the station after 2 hours outside with his arms full of fibrous plant material and his face red from the cold, but otherwise unharmed. His alien colleagues stared at him in disbelief as he stamped the snow off his boots and began removing his thermal suit. Jake's crystal body chimed with amazement as he tried to understand how Jake had survived so long in temperatures that would have been instantly fatal to any Vorthok. Dr. Kess lifted her head from her hibernation state just long enough to see Jake sorting through the plant samples he had collected. The nebulites flashed confused patterns of blue and yellow light as they tried to process what they had witnessed. In their gaseous forms, they were extremely sensitive to temperature changes, and the idea of voluntarily exposing oneself to such extreme cold was completely foreign to their understanding. They communicated among themselves through rapid light patterns that expressed their amazement at human durability and adaptability. Jake spread the fibrous plant material across one of the laboratory tables and began examining it more closely with the station's scientific equipment. Under the microscope, he could see that the plant fibers had a complex structure with thousands of tiny air pockets that created natural insulation. The material was remarkably similar to down feathers or synthetic insulation that humans used. In cold weather gear back on Earth, he realized that with some basic processing and weaving techniques he could turn this raw material into effective thermal protection. Lisa joined Jake at the laboratory table and helped him separate the plant fibers into different grades based on their thickness and insulation properties. She had grown up in Colorado and understood the principles of layered clothing and insulation from her own experience with cold weather sports. Together, they began planning how to process the plant material into something that could help their alien friends survive the continuing temperature drop. The challenge was not just creating insulation, but adapting it for species with completely different body structures and thermal needs. Jixt and the other Vorthak were crystalline beings who communicated through light patterns that traveled through their bodies. Any insulation would need to be transparent or at least translucent to avoid interfering with their natural communication abilities. Dr. Kess and the Skarn had reptilian bodies covered in scales that required flexible protection that would not restrict their movement. The Nebulites presented the biggest challenge since their gaseous forms needed containment as well as temperature control. Jake started by creating a basic prototype for himself to test the effectiveness of the plant fiber insulation. He used simple weaving techniques that he had learned in Boy Scouts to create a crude but functional fabric from the processed plant material. The work was slow and required patience, but Jake found that the fibers held together well and created a material that was both flexible and highly insulating. He reinforced the woven plant material with strips of synthetic fabric from the station's emergency supplies to create a more durable composite material. Working through the night while his alien colleagues tried to conserve body heat around the failing heating systems, Jake constructed a basic insulated jacket using the plant fiber fabric. The design was simple but incorporated principles of layered insulation that would trap warm air close to the body while allowing moisture to escape. He added synthetic materials from the emergency blankets to create reflective barriers that would help retain body heat. When Jake finished his prototype jacket, he decided to test it immediately by venturing into the coldest areas of the station. The storage rooms and outer corridors had no heating at all, and the temperature there had dropped to well below zero. Jake put on his homemade jacket and walked into these areas to see how well his creation would protect him from the extreme cold. The results were better than he had hoped, as the plant fiber insulation kept him warm and comfortable even in areas where the temperature had dropped to minus 20 degrees. The jacket was lightweight and flexible, allowing full range of motion while providing excellent thermal protection. Jake spent an hour in the unheated sections of the station and emerged feeling warm and confident that his design could help save his alien friends. Jixt and the other researchers watched with growing amazement as Jake demonstrated the effectiveness of his improvised cold weather gear. The crystal being's body chimed with excitement as he realized that the human had found a solution to their desperate situation. Dr. Kess managed to speak from her hibernation state, asking Jake to explain how the plant material could provide such effective protection against the deadly cold that was threatening all their lives. Jake explained the principles of insulation and heat retention in simple terms that his alien colleagues could understand. He showed them how the plant fibers trapped air in tiny pockets and how this created a barrier that prevented body heat from escaping while blocking cold air from reaching the skin. The concept was familiar to the aliens from their studies of native animal behavior, but they had never considered applying these principles to create artificial protection for themselves. Lisa immediately understood the potential of Jake's discovery and began helping him scale up production of the insulated material. She suggested modifications to the design that would make it more suitable for different alien physiologies, while maintaining the basic insulation properties. Together, they began planning how to create customized versions of the thermal protection for each species represented on the research station. The work required creativity and problem-solving as Jake and Lisa tried to adapt human cold weather survival techniques for beings with completely different biological needs. For the Vorthek, they would need to create transparent thermal barriers that would not interfere with light-based communication. For the Skarn, they would need flexible materials that could accommodate scales and reptilian body shapes. For the Nebulites, they would need sealed systems that could maintain both temperature and pressure for gaseous life forms. Jake began processing larger quantities of plant material while Lisa studied the physiological data for each alien species to understand their specific thermal requirements. The station's fabrication equipment was still functioning, and they could use it to create more sophisticated versions of the basic insulation concept. Time was running short as the backup heating systems continued to fail and the temperature inside the station dropped closer to the freezing point. Dr. Kess managed to provide valuable input about Skarn thermal physiology despite her increasing hibernation state, while Jixt shared information about Vorthak light transmission requirements. Even the Nebulites contributed by flashing patterns that described their atmospheric needs and pressure requirements. The entire research team was working together despite the crisis to help Jake and Lisa develop solutions that could save all their lives. As Jake worked on refining his plant fiber processing techniques, he felt a growing sense of urgency mixed with determination. His alien colleagues had become more than just research partners over the past 6 months, and he was not going to let them die from something as simple as cold weather, when the materials for survival were literally growing all around them outside the station. The situation became critical on the second day as the station's final backup heating unit began to fail and the temperature inside dropped to just above freezing. Jake and Lisa worked frantically in the main laboratory while their alien colleagues huddled together in the warmest room trying to conserve what little body heat they had left. Jixt's crystal body now had deep cracks running through it, and several small pieces had already broken off from the thermal stress. Dr. Kess had entered full hibernation and was barely breathing as her Skarn physiology shut down all non-essential functions. The Nebulites were in the worst condition, as 3 of them had already condensed into liquid form and were being kept in emergency containment units that were struggling to maintain proper pressure and temperature. Their gaseous colleagues flashed desperate red patterns as they tried to communicate their needs while fighting to maintain their own molecular cohesion in the rapidly cooling air. Jake had spent the night processing plant fibers and creating specialized insulation materials for each species, but the technical challenges were enormous. For Jixt and the other Vorthak, he needed to create thermal protection that would not interfere with their light-based communication system. Jake discovered that by processing the plant fibers into very thin layers, he could create a translucent material that allowed light to pass through while still providing excellent insulation. He reinforced this transparent insulation with processed plant resins that created a clear but effective thermal barrier. Working with Lisa, they created the first Vorthak thermal suit by carefully measuring Jixt's crystal body and designing a form-fitting garment that covered his entire structure while leaving clear panels for light transmission. The translucent plant fiber material was layered between sheets of processed resin to create a flexible but durable thermal protection system. Jake tested the light transmission properties by shining various wavelengths through the material and found that it maintained over 80% clarity while providing excellent insulation when they fitted the thermal suit on Jix. The results were immediate and dramatic. The crystal being's body temperature began to stabilize, and the stress fractures stopped spreading through his structure. Jix's relief was obvious as his body began to chime with a clearer, more musical tone, and he was able to communicate normally through his light patterns for the first time since the cold began. The other Vorthak researchers watched with hope as Jake and Lisa began creating similar thermal protection for them. The challenge of protecting Dr. Kess and the other Skarn researchers required a completely different approach since their reptilian bodies were covered in scales and needed flexible protection that would not restrict their natural movement. Jake studied Skarn physiology and realized that their scales actually provided some natural insulation, but they needed additional thermal protection around the gaps between scales where heat could escape. Lisa suggested creating a mesh-like garment that would conform to the Skarn body shape while providing focused insulation in the most vulnerable areas. They processed the plant fibers into fine threads that could be woven into a flexible mesh material that would lie flat against scales while creating warm air pockets in the gaps between them. Jake added small heating elements made from processed plant oils that would provide additional warmth in critical areas. The Skarn thermal suit was like a second skin that followed every contour of Dr. Kess's body, while providing comprehensive thermal protection. When they carefully fitted the suit on the hibernating scientist, her body temperature began to rise immediately, and within an hour she was able to emerge from hibernation and speak clearly for the first time in 2 days. Her yellow eyes brightened with gratitude as she realized that the human-designed thermal protection had saved her life. The most complex challenge was creating thermal protection for the nebulites whose gaseous forms required both temperature control and pressure regulation. Jake realized that their existing containment suits were not designed for extreme temperature variations and were actually contributing to the condensation problem by allowing heat to escape too quickly. Working with the station's fabrication equipment, Jake and Lisa created improved containment systems that incorporated plant fiber insulation around the existing pressure vessels. They added thermal regulation systems made from processed plant materials that could maintain stable temperatures, while allowing the nebulites to control their own density and pressure. The new systems were like miniature environmental suits that provided complete life support for gaseous beings in extreme conditions. The first nebulite to receive the improved containment system immediately began to return to normal gaseous form, and the bright colors returned to their molecular structure. The being flashed patterns of intense gratitude and relief as they realized they were no longer in danger of condensing into liquid form. Jake and Lisa worked quickly to create similar systems for the other nebulites, including emergency life support for the 3 who had already condensed. The 3 liquid nebulites required special treatment as Jake had to create heated chambers that could gradually return them to gaseous form without causing molecular damage. Using plant fiber insulation and carefully controlled heating elements, he built revival chambers that slowly warmed the condensed beings while providing the right atmospheric conditions for them to safely transition back to their normal state. Throughout the crisis, Jake was amazed by the cooperation and determination of all the species, working together despite their physical distress. Jix provided technical specifications for Vortha communication requirements. Even while his crystal body was cracking from thermal stress, Dr. Kess shared critical information about Skarn physiology from her hibernation state when it was needed. For the thermal suit design, the conscious nebulites flashed detailed patterns, describing the atmospheric needs of their condensed colleagues even while fighting for their own survival. Lisa proved to be an invaluable partner as her quick thinking and problem-solving skills helped adapt Jake's survival knowledge to the unique challenges of protecting alien life forms. Her background in communications technology was essential for creating the complex environmental controls needed for the nebulite containment systems. Together, they formed an effective team that combined practical survival skills with technical innovation. By the end of the second day, all the alien researchers were safely protected by their customized thermal suits, and the crisis atmosphere in the station began to change to one of amazement and gratitude. Jix's crystal body had stopped cracking and was actually beginning to repair itself now that the thermal stress had been eliminated. Dr. Kess was fully active again and fascinated by the plant fiber technology that had saved her life. The nebulites were all back in gaseous form and flashing patterns of bright colors that indicated happiness and relief. Jake stood in the laboratory, surrounded by successful thermal protection systems made from simple plant materials and basic human survival knowledge. He felt proud of what they had accomplished, but also humbled by the trust his alien colleagues had placed in him during the crisis. The temperature outside was still dropping and the solar storm continued to rage, but inside the research station, all the scientists were warm and safe thanks to innovations created from materials that had been growing right outside their windows the entire time. 3 days later, the rescue ships finally arrived to find a research station that was not only functioning but thriving despite the continued cold weather. The rescue team consisted of military personnel from several alien species who had expected to find either a destroyed facility or survivors in desperate need of immediate evacuation. Instead, they discovered healthy scientists wearing strange but effective thermal garments and working normally in conditions that should have been lethal. Captain Vex of the Corthony Rescue Fleet was the first to board the station, and his four-armed blue form moved with obvious confusion as he tried to understand what he was seeing. The Corthony were amphibious beings from water worlds, and they wore heavy environmental suits to protect them from the dry, cold air. Captain Vex had responded to dozens of emergency evacuations and had never encountered a situation where the victims had not only survived, but had actually solved their own crisis. The rescue team included Dr. Thane of Orthek, medical specialist who immediately began examining Jixt and the other crystal beings to assess their condition. Dr. Thane was amazed to find that not only had the research team survived the thermal crisis, but they showed no signs of permanent damage from the extreme temperature exposure. Jixt's crystal matrix had actually strengthened during the recovery process, and his light communication patterns were clearer than they had been before the crisis began. Commander Zara of the Hegemony Science Council arrived on the second rescue ship, and her tall insectoid form clicked with excitement as she studied Jake's improvised thermal protection systems. The Hegemony had spent centuries developing advanced environmental suits and temperature control technology, but they had never seen anything like the simple plant fiber insulation that had saved the research team. Commander Zara's compound eyes examined every detail of the thermal garments while her scientific mind tried to understand how such basic materials could be so effective. Jake found himself the center of attention as rescue team members from multiple species questioned him about his survival techniques and innovation process. The alien military personnel and scientists were fascinated by his ability to work in deadly cold conditions and his talent for creating solutions from available materials. Many of them had never encountered humans before, and they were amazed by the combination of physical durability and creative problem-solving that Jake had demonstrated. Lisa helped document the entire process as the rescue teams conducted detailed interviews with all the survivors and collected samples of the plant fiber materials for analysis. The improvised thermal protection systems were carefully studied and photographed while alien scientists tried to understand the principles behind their effectiveness. Dr. Kess provided detailed testimony about how the human-designed insulation had saved her life and allowed her to emerge from hibernation safely. The Nebulites were particularly vocal in their praise as they flashed elaborate light patterns describing how Jake's environmental suits had prevented them from condensing permanently into liquid form. Their testimony was recorded by specialized equipment that could translate their light-based communication into forms that other species could understand. The three Nebulites who had actually condensed and been revived by Jake's heated chambers became living proof of human ingenuity and determination. Commander Zara requested permission to bring Jake back to Hegemony headquarters for consultation on emergency survival protocols and environmental adaptation techniques. She explained that the galactic research community had never developed effective responses to rapid climate emergencies like the one that had struck Kepler 442b. Jake's improvised solutions represented a completely new approach to survival that could save countless lives in future emergencies. Captain Vex offered Jake a position with the Corthony Rescue Fleet where his survival skills and ability to improvise solutions under pressure would be invaluable for emergency response operations. The amphibious captain explained that most rescue operations relied on advanced technology and pre-planned procedures, but Jake had demonstrated the ability to create effective solutions from whatever materials were available in any environment. Dr. Thane was interested in studying human cold weather adaptations and thermal regulation capabilities for medical research purposes. The Vortex scientist was amazed by Jake's ability to function normally in temperatures that would kill most other species and wanted to understand the biological mechanisms that made such survival possible. He offered Jake opportunities to work with medical research teams studying environmental adaptation across multiple species. The rescue operation became a case study in human problem-solving abilities as word of Jake's achievements spread throughout the galactic scientific community. Research stations across the galaxy began requesting human personnel not for their specialized scientific knowledge but for their survival skills and innovative thinking. The simple act of creating warm clothing from local plant materials had revealed capabilities that other species had never encountered before. Jake was overwhelmed by the attention and opportunities being offered to him, but he remained focused on the practical aspects of what had happened. He worked with the rescue teams to document his techniques in detail so they could be taught to other species and used in future emergencies. The plant fiber processing methods were simple enough that any species could learn them, and the insulation principles could be adapted for different environmental challenges. Lisa was also recognized for her contributions to the solution, as her technical skills and quick thinking had been essential for adapting Jake's survival knowledge to the unique needs of different alien species. She received offers to work with communications and technology development teams that were interested in her ability to bridge the gap between practical solutions and advanced engineering. The research station became a training facility where Jake taught mixed species survival courses to military personnel and civilian researchers from across the galaxy. His classes covered basic principles of environmental adaptation and resource utilization that could be applied in any emergency situation. The simple techniques he had learned as a Boy Scout in Minnesota became standard curriculum for galactic emergency response training. Jixt decided to continue working with Jake on long-term research projects that would study human survival capabilities and develop new emergency protocols based on human innovation techniques. The crystal being had gained deep respect for human adaptability and wanted to understand how these capabilities could benefit the entire galactic research community. Dr. Kess established a new research program focused on studying local materials and resources that could be used for emergency survival in any environment. She credited Jake with teaching her to look at plant life not just as subjects for scientific study, but as potential sources of solutions for practical problems. The Nebulites created a permanent memorial pattern in their light-based communication system that honored Jake's role in saving their lives and demonstrated human courage and ingenuity to future generations of gaseous beings. The final rescue ship departed Kepler 442b, carrying detailed reports and samples that would revolutionize emergency response procedures throughout the galaxy. Jake's simple jacket made from local plant materials had become a symbol of humanity's greatest strength, which was the ability to find solutions where others saw only insurmountable problems. The human approach of adapting to challenges rather than being defeated by them had proven that sometimes the most advanced technology could not match the power of basic survival skills and creative thinking.